They did the usual sort of old Stalinist left-wing trick that if you disagreed, you were a Nazi. And after that, it all became a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy and a cycle. And to do with it also was their hatred of human beings.
Hello, I'm John O'Brien. I'm Head of Communications with MCC Brussels, and welcome to another edition of Deep Dives. Deep Dives is the series where we take a more in-depth look at the reports produced by MCC Brussels. Today, I'm delighted to bring to you a report called Lights Out. Is the EU failing on energy policy? And I'm delighted to be joined by James Woudhuysen.
Good morning.
I recently visited Ireland. I was visiting my father, and he lives in the countryside. He's scared to put on the lights. He is cutting his heat during the day because he's fearful about the next energy bill. My brother lives in Dublin. He's got 2 young kids, a young family. He goes an hour into the countryside every couple of weeks to pick up logs because he's scared to turn on his gas because he's scared of the energy bill. The situation that's affecting my family in the Republic of Ireland is affecting families right across Europe. How come the EU's energy policy, James, according to your report, brought us to such a situation?
Well, that's very chastening. We have occasional outages for power in the UK, so Brexit didn't protect us from that. I think the first reason is that I tweeted a little time ago, why can't Keir Starmer, or it could be the Commission, read the room? And the answer is they're not in the room. They're somewhere else. They have no conception, no experience, no traveling to your brother or your dad. And so they're unaware of these conditions. The most they can muster is an EU report on poverty, or possibly even fuel poverty. But the real life of real people is something they're totally separate from.
So is the EU prioritizing environmental ideology over energy security for the citizens?
Well, it would claim it isn't. It would claim the two go together. And one of the most ridiculous but frequent tropes of the authorities is that if you rely on the sun and in particular the wind, you'll be able to get energy security. And like all of these things, it has a superficial appeal, just as the doctrine that when you install a wind turbine, all the costs are free from then on. And it doesn't seem to occur to them because they don't have a background in engineering, most of them. Even if they do, they'll just sort of wave it aside, that if you have solar and wind, it's not only intermittent, which is widely observed, but it's dominated by China, the manufacturing of all of that, and solar. So, you're not independent from the world and the world market for energy. And as a result, you have lost your energy security, even on those grounds that you think where it's strongest, because any country can get sun and wind most of the time. So they miss the point about security. They miss also how they talk about clean energy. It's hundreds of tons of steel and hundreds of tons of concrete that go into a wind turbine. Is that clean? It's certainly not. Any more than an electric car battery is clean. It's not clean.
So what would a more pragmatic energy policy look like?
Well, it's got to be a combination of things. I'm not ruling out wind and solar. I just don't want pipe dreams about them. Obviously, gas is important. It's relatively cheap quite a lot of the time. It doesn't have to come from Russia to use it. I think nuclear power has been widely neglected and closed down, except for France. It takes time to build, too much time, because the regulations are ornate and baroque. So you've got to have gas, you've got to have coal, providing you take certain measures about it. You've got to have nuclear. You should be looking forward to small modular reactors, which are the machines that go into submarines. You should be intensifying research on fusion, even the nuclear fusion, not just fission, even though that's more for the medium to long term. You've got to, muster all the barrels you can.
Can Europe balance sustainability with energy abundance? It seems as though the message we get in Europe, in places like Germany, is you have to consume less, you have to use less. Is it possible to have sustainability and energy abundance?
Well, the person who first publicized and popularized sustainability was Margaret Thatcher in 1988 in a speech to the Royal Society in London. I remain confused as to what it means. A lot of the time it's just sustainable. You put the adjective sustainable in front of everything. Sustainable wood logs for your relatives. And sustainable consumption styles. And it doesn't mean anything. All it means is it's got a seal of approval from Brussels, and you can bask in a sort of solar-powered halo, about your goodness and your moral rectitude. So I don't think that there's any evidence to suggest that sustainability, and particularly the resort to green technologies, cheapens energy bills. On the contrary, all the evidence is to show that they get more expensive.
That's what my dad would tell you, because a lot of the energy increases in the bill that he's experienced is because of green tax.
Yeah, well, that's true, and it's much more labor intensive. Everything you have to do in the green world is about efficiency in resource utilization, not in efficiency in labor utilization. So you have to run around turning those lights off, even though lights consume very little electricity, compared with central heating, for example. But nevertheless, you've got to build that sort of sustainable mindset into every minute of your day, always wondering how you can do less, consume less, be a better citizen, and so on, rather than making a great work of art or a great scientific breakthrough.
Is some level of energy austerity inevitable in making this sort of transition towards green?
I think if you ban nuclear and you ban gas and coal, pretty much, it is. There's no doubt about it. These are really the 21st century, with the exception of coal, the 21st century sources of energy supply. Wind turbines, often called wrongly windmills, but you're going back. You're going back to feudalism, back to the clerical worldview. And that is backward philosophically, backward politically, and economically. It's going to take you to the cleaners, no doubt about it.
So that brings us on to a big question. What role should nuclear energy play in Europe's future?
Well, it's very important for medicine, something that's often forgotten. It's obviously important for understanding particle physics because of all the things that go on in and around a reactor and all the expertise that's built up around that. But energy supply is something that it ought to be doing a lot more of. It's no substitute for gas, because gas, you want it, you can get it. With nuclear, as you will know, with the rods and all the things that go on inside a reactor, it takes time to switch on and off. It's not as dispatchable, that's the name for it, or the adjective, as gas. It's becoming more dispatchable and more flexible. But what is often forgotten in all of this, John, is that it's invidious to select any particular source of energy. Right? The energy that we have in Europe, as elsewhere, is a system. So the cables are important. The grid is important. The use, if you like, of direct current is important, which suffers far fewer transmission losses. So it's not just the reactor that we need. We need the whole system to work together from a variety of sources, which and each individual source, the cost of it cannot be computed by itself, right? So when people say, wind power is 9 times cheaper than gas, I have to laugh, because, what they're using is a thing, just for your viewers, the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE. That includes land costs, interest rate costs, and many other things. So right away, you're not dealing with the price per megawatt or megawatt hour. You're dealing with government policy, and whether it connects up to anything, the particular source that you're using. So the answer is that we need a lot more nuclear power everywhere in Europe, not next to big cities if we can avoid it. It could be floating. You might have to go to the Russians for that. I'd rather not. It needs a systematic approach because energy is a system, and we need everything to make it happen over long distances.
What are the main obstacles to a nuclear resurgence in Europe?
Well, it's regulation, right? In the UK, for example, we have maybe 20 sub-regulators looking at every installation. You've got the inspectorate, you've got about 4 or 5 major regulators, and then they've got the Scots, the Welsh, the Department for the Countryside, or whatever it is. So, it's jobs for the boys, like so much of what happens nowadays. Now, you do need regulation, but the scale of regulation you have at the moment is delaying things. And then the Greens turn around and say, nuclear power, you used to say it would be too cheap to meter, James, but it actually is very expensive. Well, it's expensive because of all the planning inquiries, the demonstrations, the boycotts, and the green mindset of many regulators. And the alternatives are often so much worse. We all know that Germany is reliant on lignite, which is one of the smelliest, dirtiest sources of energy, of a particular kind of coal that they used to mainly get from Czechoslovakia. So, you can say nuclear power brings with it nuclear waste. If you actually look at the size of the waste, I think all the nuclear power in Britain that's ever been used generates about 7 or 11 floors of Canary Wharf, the skyscraper in the city of London. So are we really saying in the 21st century we can't deal with a whole large warehouse full of 70 years of nuclear waste? We can't deal with it. Just too much.
So in the public's mindset, indeed, fostered by those who are exclusively green and want to be exclusively green, is fear-mongering about nuclear energy. Going back to Long Mile Island, Chernobyl, is it the case that many people involved in nuclear tell me that there's been a revolution in the type of technology that you'd find at a nuclear plant these days, that it is much safer than it was before? Has that translated into the public's understanding of nuclear today as opposed to nuclear yesterday?
Well, it hasn't translated. It's 3 Mile Island. You're mixing up there, Long Island and 3 Mile Island. Well, nobody died in 3 Mile Island. Nobody died because of nuclear power in the Fukushima explosion, but it sent Angela Merkel round the bend. And if you look at Chernobyl, there's no golf ball protection device around it before it exploded. It was a Stalinist confection, subject to Stalinist experiments. And in fact, Greenpeace thoroughly overestimated the damage caused to human beings and flora and fauna. You will have seen the documentaries with the animals running around in what's left of Chernobyl. So the original history of nuclear power, since really the 70s, which is when all the green stuff really took off, has always been fear-mongering, as you say. Now, if you look at the advances since, only the Chinese have pretty much achieved what's called a Generation 4 nuclear reactor. Generation 4 nuclear reactor is characterized by the fact that it has passive safety around it. What passive safety means is if something goes wrong, it does all the mechanisms to fix it. It can't really go wrong. You don't need any experiments, thank God, like they did at Chernobyl. You don't need human intervention. People can be asleep at night and it will still switch itself off. Now, as far as I'm aware, last time I looked, the Chinese have got one of those active at the moment. So, there's no grounds for complacency. Nuclear power is heavy stuff, and no doubt about it. So there needs to be a lot more progress, but an enormous amount has been learned since the 70s. And, the expertise is out there. One of the problems is, particularly in Germany, if they wanted to revive it, and even in Britain, the workforce and the expertise hands-on isn't there. It's dying because the old nuclear engineers are fading out. They're in their 70s, their 80s, and so on. So we have to equip a new generation of youth, not just with the outlook that says, we want abundant, cheap, plentiful, 24-hour, 365 days a year electricity, and nuclear is a great way to get it, but we have to equip them with subatomic physics and everything that goes on in the nucleus.
Has the EU truly reduced its dependence on Russian energy, or has it just shifted the problem?
I think it's done a little bit of both. The Russian gas is entering the EU in considerable quantities. It's going through India, I suspect. It's probably going through the Middle East. There's all kinds of ways of getting around the sanctions and the boycotts. So the overall complacency of EU elites, and particular the fondness that the Germans in the upper echelons have for Russia for historical reasons, quite misguided and misplaced in my view. That continues. It's backdoor man, as the blues singers used to have it. So you make the appearance of being free of Putin, but in fact, you're still pretty much in hock to him.
When you look at the European Green Deal, does it balance environmental goals with economic and employment realities, or do you think that there's a blind spot when it comes to the EU elites pushing a deal that could have negative consequences for the citizens of Europe?
Well, it's not a blind spot. It's complete myopia, right? It's not that they're kind of missing the full picture. Their whole picture is wrong. And there's a very simple way of demonstrating this, I think. Have you ever seen a green job? Have you ever seen thousands and thousands of people in a factory making wind turbines in Europe? There's one or two. Siemens has caught a big cold on it. Gamesa is in some difficulty. Other Nordic manufacturers have problems. And the amount of jobs created is very, very modest. That's when the New Deal of Roosevelt in the 30s created a lot of jobs. There's no doubt about that. It was a thoroughly Keynesian policy. I don't like Keynes very much, but the fact is, through the Tennessee Valley Authority and everything else, thousands and thousands, millions of jobs were created. That's not happening in Europe. Do you know anybody? Have any of your friends, apart from working for green NGOs, and they may not be your friends, John, but, apart from desk jobs, how much can we really say that there are even Germans, installing, maintaining, repairing, and taking home a nice salary with green technologies? You just don't know people like that most of the time. It is not a big job generator. So the whole promise of, green technology is actually a source of economic growth. If there are no jobs there, unless it's all being done by robots, and robots are coming to wind turbines for maintenance and so on, but not in the quantities that, would really make a difference to prices, to growth, to you and me.
James, could you tell us what role should natural gas play in the EU's energy transition?
Well, first of all, I contest the whole idea of an energy transition, right? That, the amount of energy that is generated by renewable sources is always quoted at sort of 40 or 50%. But what they're talking about is the energy the electricity throughout the whole year. What they don't talk about is the Dunkelflaus periods, when there's no wind, no sun. It's called Britain. And there's no energy generated whatsoever. And unless you can get it like that, if you're in a hospital, you're going to die. So the question of dispatchability, as I described it, of intermittency, which is the opposite of that, is a life or death question. Now, natural gas is the most dispatchable energy source. There's a lot of it just been discovered in Britain, which is not part of the EU, but there's plenty of it in France. There's supposed to be a fair amount in Poland, but they gave up. And there's probably a lot more that we're not allowed to explore for, right? Because to explore for it suggests that you might use it, and to use it would be the end of the world.
Well, what happened, James, though, that I don't think you're against the idea of wind. I don't think
No,
you're against the idea of solar.
Yeah.
But what happened that we can't have this balance where we'd use natural gas, that we'd use nuclear, as well as using these new energy sources? It seems to me as though coal, for example, that people have said that coal is over. We want the end of coal. But as I understand it, coal is necessary for manufacturing. You cannot make things without coal. What happened that we became so imbalanced in our view?
Well, I think it's not just coal. It's more gas that we need for making glass, making cement, making steel. It's heat, industrial heat. Well, if you take the view as the European Commission does, and so many people do really since the 60s, that we live in a consumer society, and you measure GDP as it is measured by consumption, then you will take the view that these industrial processes are not important. Right? They will be out of sight and out of mind. And you'll also take the view that it's fine if China does them. And as a result, everything becomes about the household and its consumption. And therefore, sources of electricity and of heat that are of industrial strength tend to go out the window. Now, the other thing about it is that, since the end of the Cold War, elite quarters needed something to orientate themselves. They used to orientate against the Soviet Union, against the trade unions, and that, for all its faults, at least put their feet on the ground. Then they reached an era when they didn't know what was happening. They were always worried that Russians would penetrate Europe with nuclear suitcases. That was how mad they got. And then they thought, well, look, what can we do to inspire the youth, to get our feet back on the ground, to give us a platform for the future? We'll save the planet. And of course, it would be wrong to deny that there weren't some nasty moments environmentally then and indeed now. But they then turned it into a whole religion, and they did the usual sort of old Stalinist left-wing trick that if you disagreed, you were a Nazi. And after that, it all became a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy and a cycle. And to do with it also was their hatred of human beings. Love the planet, hate humanity. And, if you look at people like the fellow Dutchman, like me, Frans Timmermans, his whole being radiates contempt for the masses. And therefore the masses, as consumers, have got to put up, shut up, I'm in charge, I know things. Well, he's, very ignorant. And therefore they must lower their consumption, adopt the hair shirt, turn the lights off, and as Jimmy Carter said back in the 70s, put on a sweater. This is the sweater theory of progress. You're cold, don't organize new energy. Just, add another layer for the birds.
James Woudhuysen, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us today. Your report, Lights Out, people can find details of the report in the notes below this podcast. And it's well worth a read. Thank you for the education you gave us today and raising some of these questions. I know that people are concerned about energy, want to understand it more, and I think this report's help us get there. This is John O'Brien signing off for MCC Brussels. Join us on another edition of Deep Dives.